Thank you, Lucy. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you to our professors and our moderator. Tonight's Federalist Society event is entitled Wizards, Hobbits, and Conservative Law Professors, Mythical Creatures in Legal Education. Francesca and I will introduce both of our speakers and our moderators before we get into this. First, I should say there's a disclaimer that the views expressed by our speakers do not necessarily represent the views of the Federalist Society as a whole, as an organization. With that out of the way, let's get started. So our first speaker here is Professor Teresa Collett. Teresa Collett is a professor at the University of St. Thomas School of Law, where she serves as director of the school's Prolife Center. As a political and cultural conservative, Collett has long had an interest in the dwindling political diversity of law school faculties. She has written about competing definitions of diversity, as well as the surprising uniformity of the political views of law professors at both secular and Catholic law schools. She received her Juris Doctorate at the University of Oklahoma College of Law and is an elected member of the American Law Institute. She has testified before committees of the U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, and other legislative bodies on the issues of marriage, parental rights, and abortion. In 2009, Pope Benedict appointed Collett to a 5-year term on the Pontifical Council for the Family. She has served as Special Attorney General for the states of Oklahoma and Kansas, as well as assisting other states' attorney generals in defending laws protecting human life and marriage. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, Professor.
Delighted to be here.
And Francesca will introduce Professor Hensis and our moderator tonight.
So Professor John Hasnas teaches ethics at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business and is a professor of law by courtesy at Georgetown Law. He's also the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for the Study of Markets and Ethics. Professor Hasnas received a BA in philosophy from Lafayette College, a JD and PhD in legal philosophy from Duke University, and an LLM in legal education from Temple Law School. He has previously been an associate professor of law at the George Mason University School of Law, a visiting associate professor of law at the Duke University School of Law, and the Washington College of Law at American University. Professor Hasnas was a Law and Humanities Fellow at the Temple University School of Law, and has also been a visiting scholar at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics in DC and the Social Philosophy and Policy Center in Bowling Green, Ohio. His scholarship concerns ethics and white-collar crime, jurisprudence, and legal history. And our moderator is Brady Marzin. Brady is a junior in the School of Foreign Service, majoring in international politics. He's the current president of the Georgetown University College Republicans and is interested in applying to law school. Brady has formerly interned for the National Economic Council and the Office of International Economic Affairs at the White House, for the Heritage Foundation, and for Madras LLC, where he assisted the Director of Policy and Research. Brady is also the founder of the Worldview newsletter, which is designed to promote serious and policy-oriented conservative thought. He has experience in campaign work and is involved in geopolitics. And now I'll let Brady begin.
Thank you so much, Nicholas and Francesca. Those intros were fantastic, and we appreciate you guys hosting us tonight. First question to Professor Hasnas and Professor Collett. Thank you guys so much for being here. We talk about wizards and hobbits and conservative law professors in the same category, these mythical creatures. Are they? Is it a problem, right? Where do we see it at law schools, and is there actually a dearth of conservative law professors? What are the numbers there?
So Brady, if you will forgive me for the risk of boring your colleagues, I'd like to share my screen if technologically I can do that, because there are actually a number of studies that Professor Hasnas and I have both studied, and they kind of show that. But perhaps I'll just read some of the data since screen sharing is disabled.
It should be enabled now.
Try again?
It should be enabled now.
Perfect, thank you. All right. So let me just, as you can see, let me get to where it's not just this, sorry. There we go. I have multiple screens open, and so hopefully, oh, for heaven's sake, there we go. Let's talk just a minute about what really is happening out there, or what happened in 2016. And I would just give these couple of examples before we look at the data. If you all recall, at the election of President Trump, law schools and universities across the country had almost a uniform presumption that their students were going to be in distress and incapable of performing adequately on those days. And they did everything from cancel classes and cancel exams, hold, grief sessions. And I think the law students will find this particularly odd, because I can't even imagine hiring a lawyer who would be in such grief over that. But yet the University of Michigan Law School, which is the top 20 law school, went so far as to sponsor a post-election event. And this is from their website, with, quote, comforting food and stress-busting self-care activities such as coloring, Play-Doh, positive card making, Legos, and bubbles with your fellow law students. As you can imagine, conservative students and faculty, as well as a number of conservative commentators, sort of rolled their eyes and had some real concerns about that. But that's just evidence at these elite law schools, there was this presumption that students were so fragile that they couldn't withstand the possibility of losing a political contest. And it probably is in part because, as Professor James Lindgren, who's done the most comprehensive study in this area, has established, racial, gender, religious, and political groups, which ones are the most unrepresented? And here's what's sort of shocking. The data in 1997 showed that women and minorities were underrepresented compared to some populations, but Republicans and Christians were usually more underrepresented. By the late 1990s, the proportion of US population that was neither Republican nor Christian was only 9%, but the majority of law professors was drawn from that small minority. Further, though women were strongly underrepresented compared to full-time working population, all of that underrepresentation was among Republican women. That I might be that person, all of whom were and are almost teaching from law schools. In fact, James Lindgren, after a presentation at the AALS, came up to me and said, you don't exist statistically, which is really troubling. If you look at it, the pattern of representation in law teaching tends to show that diversity hiring and affirmative action hiring would point in different but overlapping directions. Affirmative action would say, recruit more women and minorities, but if we're really serious about an intellectual diversity on the campus, they should be recruiting more Republicans, Christians, and Latinas. In part because of the underrepresentation of Christians and Republicans, it may be too large and too consistent to be the result of discrimination. Culture may play an important role, but the central assumption is that when you see that sort of statistical disparity, those of you who have taken labor law, and certainly Professor Hosnes knows from his markets and ethics research, the law will presume that there is discriminatory bias going on. When you incorporate data from the most recent ABA release, what you find is that the largest unrepresented groups in law today are white Christians, white Republicans, and Republicans. And it's not just Professor Lundgren. So you can't say, oh, well, it must be bias. You've got Deborah Jones Merritt, hardly a Republican conservative, who has studied the progression of candidates through the hiring phase to their tenuring, and found that, in fact, the number of conservatives declines because of during that testing period. Daniel Klein, they looked at the voter affiliation. You've got John McGinnis, who looked at political contributions. And then you've got James Phillips, who sort of explores the different possible explanation. And I'll stop there because I know Professor Hosnes has written about sort of how do we explain this?
Okay, so I guess I'm on. I'll give you a chance to take your screen down.
It's down.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the studies that were just quoted, and if you're asking about facts, as a matter of fact, there is an overwhelming disparity between people who would be described as left, liberal, and progressive, and people who would be described as center right and conservative or libertarian. So the statistics are that there's a massive imbalance, and that's just the facts as they are. I think you were asking about whether this is the case or not. There's a lot of evidence that, as a matter of fact, it is the case. So I'm sure what you want to talk about is what the significance of that is, what caused it, whether it's a problem. But I think that all of the empirical studies will show that in law faculties, it's not limited to law faculties, but in law faculties, there is a wide disparity. It is also the case that the most underrepresented group is Republican women. But James Lindgren's study was one of the few ones that counted in that way, because the studies that are usually done divide people up by race, by ethnicity, by things like that. They don't link up political or conservative positions with the other groups. So the studies that were just quoted are the ones that do make that linkage.
Yeah, thank you for incredibly informative presentation there. Looking at those numbers, what has caused this? Why has this happened? Why does one political side have such an overwhelming advantage across the country in educations of legal education, or in institution of legal education? Why is that happening?
We probably each have our opinion. I'll let you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that I really liked about one of the articles you published is the recognition that part of the reason that when you're on a hiring committee for a law school or for any academic unit, you're going to have, at least we have, and I've taught at multiple law schools, you get a lecture at the start of the hiring season about, we need more women, we need more diversity, we need more minorities, we need this, we need that. And in some schools, they actually, send somebody from HR in to sort of outline what you have to do. And the presumption there is, because these committees are largely white, are largely male, although that's less true today, that people are going to want to hire people that look like and think like themselves. And yet that same presumption, many law faculty will reject when I say about a potential candidate, this looks like a really great candidate. Well, yes, but did you see their writing on, take your pick, Roe versus Wade, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, Obergefell, the most recent opinion on Title VII, incorporating transgender. And all of a sudden we're off to the races. So I think it is that desire to duplicate ourselves that we see intellectually, and there just aren't enough conservatives to counter that.
Yeah, I think that's correct. It's hard to account for the way things play out. I think that the disparity in viewpoint diversity predates a lot of the diversity movement, and it's explainable on psychological grounds without having to see any animus. And I'll illustrate it with something from my own background. I spent 4.5 years on the faculty at George Mason University Law School. And the reason why that's interesting is because that law school is not predominantly left-wing. In fact, it's one of the few law schools where I would say a conservative and libertarian viewpoint is dominant. And while I was there, I observed their review and hiring practices. And because they were mostly libertarian and conservative, they were absolutely committed to doing everything on a meritocratic basis. So it was always, we're going to hire strictly on the basis of merit. We only want to get people who do good work. And they were committed to that. And every time they went through the hiring process, they hired another conservative or libertarian. And the reason is because those were the only people doing good work. It's what the way you make judgments of merit are often determined by your pre-existing beliefs, by your judgments and things like that. Just assume that that's happening in many other law schools on the other side, and you'll understand why before anything having to do with diversity, there tends to be a increasing uniformity of viewpoint. So personally in my career, the most wonderful thing is when I find a brilliant, smart person who does great work and disagrees with me, because then we really have interesting discussions and I learn and I get better. I love to find that. But when it comes to hiring and you're making judgments of merit, people who are writing things that you recognize as correct, seems to you that they're doing good work. And the person who's an iconoclast or says something that's unusual that you're not familiar with, maybe in some kind of objective world, you'd say, look at how wonderful that is. But it just, if the hiring committee is 6 people and you need almost all people to vote the same way, it's going to sound wrong to enough people so that this doesn't get through. And it's a general feature that the way people judge merits can tend to make people group themselves into common ideological viewpoints. My personal opinion is if you really wanted ideological diversity, that would require attention. You'd have to consciously know that you're going for it, and you'd have to guard against the natural tendency to see other people's work as good when it corresponds with your way of thinking. So it would take consciousness to go after that. And there's very few places that actually put in the time and effort to make that kind of conscious decision.
There's a wonderful book that reinforces everything that you just said, which is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind.
Yeah.
He's a psychology professor at NYU. And I actually open every single one of my classes with requiring students to do an online exercise that he's developed. Because what it stresses is that we all like to think, along with Aristotle, that we are rational animals. But in fact, he makes the analogy that our emotions and what attract us emotionally is the elephant, and our reason is this small rider hanging on for dear life on the back saying, no, let's not go into the jungle. We need to go over here to the lake. And that it's really hard to overcome that sort of emotional response and the tribalism that comes along with it. And it's a wonderful book. And the students, we spend a lot of time on it. We spend 2 classes on it, because I say to them, as a lawyer, you will be in front of judges and jurors and have clients who have completely different political beliefs. You may not have clients that have completely different, but I guarantee you'll have judges that do. I guarantee you're going to have jurors that do, or board members in a corporate setting. And if you cannot have some sympathy to the way they reason through things and the desires they have, you are not going to be successful. You are not going to persuade a jury of important things on behalf of your clients if you simply cannot wrap your mind around how they think and what is of value to them. So they tolerate it.
We're probably going to be a very boring panel because we're going to have way too much agreement. But I similarly would recommend any of Jonathan Haidt's books. So he's got 3 books out. They're all great. And as a matter of fact, I just invited him to a symposium we're doing on freedom of speech, and he's not coming because he's writing a 4th book. So that's probably a better use of his time. But any of those books are really worth reading to understand why things come out the way they do without having to attribute bad motives and evil tendencies to people. We all tend to think our opponents are ill-motivated, Machiavellian, bad people doing bad things, and it's almost always false. Maybe not always, but it's almost always false. And Jonathan Haidt's work helps us see that it's something else that's producing these results.
The other book he's written that will be of interest perhaps to those of you who are watching this is The Coddling of the American Mind. And if you don't have time for a book, which as law students I completely understand, there is at least it grew out of an article that he published in The Atlantic. And it's terrific because it talks about increasing levels of anxiety among students. And how students' perceptions of what professors are doing, and my own experience over the past quarter decade as a law professor has been there. It is remarkable how much higher the anxiety is, how much more conscious students are, how they appear to their colleagues in a way that is really counterproductive in the classroom. I try to tell them the first day, I'm training thoroughbreds. And if you give me a good answer, guess what? Unlike undergraduate, your reward's going to be a harder question. And then you give me another good one, and it's an even harder question. And I'm going to test you till you can't jump anymore. Okay. And so when you walk out of a classroom having been grilled for an hour, you should think, wow, she really liked my answers. What you should fear is when I look at you and go, Mr. Morrison, Mr. Osmus, can you help him?
Would you like help from pro counsel is my line.
That's actually what I say too.
Brady, I'm going to go back to you for the following reason. So I'll let you structure the conversation because there's now two issues in front of us. One is the question of the ideological makeup of law school faculties. We've been talking about that, and perhaps that's interesting. There's another issue, which is the one that was just brought up, which is students' attitudes when discussing matters and sensitivity and fear of speaking out, which is important, but it seems to me to be a different topic. So it's the Federalist Society's time. You can ask us to address the issues that you think are the ones we should be talking about.
This has been fantastic thus far. I'll throw in a question to channel the conversation here. Talking about the lack of conservative legal professors, what impact does that have on the diversity of thought among students, right? Do you see an actual impact and an effect there, or is that something that we talk about as a problem, but doesn't reflect the wider student body?
Okay, I'll let Teresa go first again on this because perhaps this could be an area where there may be some disagreement. I don't know, let's see.
I think there is a great difference between having someone describe a contrary position, which every law professor that is worthy of their status can do. I mean, many of us, certainly not all, but many of us have actually been practicing lawyers, and many of us continue to have some limited practice, even while being professors. And so I tell students again, if you don't understand the other side as well as they do, and preferably better, you're not ready for trial. So I can explain, for example, the position that Roe is worthy of continuation and expansion, but I don't believe it. And there's a reason I don't believe it. And I have reasons I can give to students. And so I think it's much better for students to hear someone come in who is the local vice president or counsel for the local Planned Parenthood, who believes it to their core and can articulate it with that sort of emotional support. And that's even, and it's not that I don't think I'm a really good oral argument person. I am, but I just think there's a value in engaging in the conversation with someone who has the underlying values that support the position they're articulating. Then it's better to have somebody describe both if that's all you can get. But when we had the marriage amendment in the state, and I represented the Catholic Conference in a number of situations on that point, I always invited my colleague from the University of Minnesota who headed the marriage equality into my classroom and said, Dale, take your best shot. Here's my best shot. Now, I pretty uniformly lost because of the students' predispositions, I think. But I think it's really, really valuable. And I think something is lost in that.
Okay, well, you asked, your question was about the effect this has on students. And I'm going to I'll make 2 points in answer. All right, the first point has to do with the significance of ideological viewpoint among law professors. And I'm going to suggest that that is greatly exaggerated. And here's why. First of all, I'll make a distinction. There's 2 types of law that we study: public law and private law. Public law is the constitutional stuff. That's all anybody ever talks about. That's the less important body of law. Private law, contract law, property law, tort law, all that, that's law. And your ideological viewpoint often doesn't make that much difference in the way you present this material. So most of what students do, it doesn't matter if my professors are liberal or conservative or anything else. If I'm studying torts, I'm studying torts. And if all I care about is he's a good teacher, he can do the Socratic method well, he's open-minded, he or she be good at what they're doing. The place where this matters is in public law, when people want to argue about what the government should be doing and how the Constitution should be interpreted. Now, this is a personal viewpoint on my part. I find all of that to be a waste of time and nonsense. But that's not law. That's just people who want to do political philosophy dressed up in a law school. So it matters with regard to that kind of government political philosophy, number one. Number two, it matters at the elite top law schools, and it matters much, much less at most law schools, where the purpose of the law school faculty is to have the students graduate and pass the bar and become lawyers. And this abstract constitutional theorizing is less important. All of the publicity, all of the press comes from what happens at the top elite law schools. I think some of the quotes that Teresa started off with were from the University of Michigan. I'm at Georgetown. You can pull anything you want out of Georgetown also. But this is a small part of what legal education is all about. So that's number one. Here's point number two. I am both at the law school and I'm on the main campus. I deal with law students. I also deal with graduate students and undergraduates. And I often talk to undergraduates, and especially undergraduates who want to go to law school. So Brady, you were introduced as someone like that. And if I'm talking to people who are conservative or libertarian, they're worried because if I go to law school, won't all of the faculty be opposed to my viewpoint? And the answer is yes, and that's great. That's exactly what you want. It's the best possible situation for you. Why? What do lawyers do? Lawyers' job is to make strong arguments for their client's position and learn how to build arguments, how to answer opponents' arguments, how to create the strongest type of logical arguments to arrive at a position. Well, how would you train for that? You train for that by having people disagree with you and have to overcome their points. If everybody already agrees with you and they just go along, you don't get trained very well. It's tough to be a progressive or a liberal law student in an elite law school where all the faculty agree with you. You don't get much training, number one. Number two, students don't believe it because sometimes they want to go to graduate school. I convince them law school is the best educational setting you can ever be in. I am talking to the undergraduate Federalist Society, so you all are not aware of this, but when you go to law school, there are no grades at all during the semester, and your grade is determined entirely by an exam at the end, which is graded anonymously. And what that means is you can be a conservative or a libertarian gadflying class for 3 months. You can express yourself freely. You don't have to inhibit yourself with regard to the teacher, and it can't affect your grade. If you do good work, you get a good grade. There's no more liberating environment for a conservative or a liberal student. So I think it's, this is not a problem for students. The problem for students is the one that Teresa brought up earlier, and that's the reaction of their fellow students and the social pressure brought upon people who would express viewpoints that are not progressive enough. So that's a real problem. But as far as having too much ideological uniformity on the left in law school faculties, that I don't believe is a problem for students at all. In fact, it just makes you better lawyers. Go to law school. It's a great place to be, and you'll have a great experience learning to support your position. By the way, if you can't, then you should change your mind. But being challenged by people who disagree with you might lead you to believe, you know what, I'm wrong. That happens, that can happen. But if it doesn't, if you're right, you'll know why you're right, and you'll have really strong arguments and the ability to support your position. And you'll know what kind of arguments on the other side to expect. Whereas the people who are liberal, they run into a libertarian, they don't know what to say. They've never heard of us before. They don't know how to answer. They just find us unbelievable. And so anyway, it's a way of saying that I think that it's not that big a problem for the students.
I think your intro though was prophetic, because we now do have strong disagreements. I think that while con law, students are always so disappointed in con law when you're learning about foreign powers of the presidency, structural constraints. But I teach property law, and students, we talk about things like the Housing Discrimination Act and the basis on which it should be extended or not. We do things like whether the Fair Housing Act is based on the desire for integration, or is it just non-discrimination? When we draft wills, we talk about disinheriting children and whether that's just. And as a lawyer, would you facilitate the disinheritance of a spouse? Should you draft a will that tries to impoverish a handicapped child who would need those resources? So I'm not quite sure. I think that all the private law, in fact, is as disconnected from political reality as you suggest. Now, it may be that I just choose to introduce those things, but it's odd that they're in the notes in my casebook, and I use the most popular property casebook that I disagree with, so I often teach against it, but nonetheless. So I don't think it's as isolated, but I do think you're right that a fair-minded professor. My husband at one point said, if I were your student and you wanted me to write on an issue that I don't care about, but I know you do deeply, I'd take the opposite side, because I think you bend over so far to be fair that sometimes the conservative students might not quite get the full benefit of the doubt, because you don't want any weak links. So I don't know. I think it's a hard thing.
Well, I'd like to take your course, because your description of the questions that you have the students investigate didn't sound to me like political questions. They sounded to me like questions of what's the just thing to do? What's the fair result? I mean, law is a tool. Law is not an end in itself. It's a tool. It's a tool for making society be a good society, or society be the kind of society we think it should be, or a just society. In teaching law, we should always be reminding them that there's the underlying question of do the rules serve justice or not? That's an important way of teaching private law. When we get to constitutional law, it's abstract political philosophy, but property, when I do torts, the question always is, what kind of society do we want to have? Should it be, how much care should we have to use? How much should we have to protect ourselves? And if we go one way, will that have a bad effect on society? If we go another, and the students will have their own ideas of what a just society looks like. The less partisan and political it is, the more interesting the discussions are in class, because the students don't really already have answers that have been pre-established in their minds. And when you get them to think about things for the first time, it can be, oh, that's why I recommend people go to law school. It's a wonderful learning experience. And sometimes you encounter things that you haven't before. One last point on this about the effect on students. I'm concerned about political indoctrination for my daughter when she's in elementary school or middle school or maybe even high school. And I might be concerned with the education undergraduates are getting at Georgetown. By the time I'm teaching law students, if they're going to be indoctrinated, that's already happened. So it doesn't really matter whether there's indoctrination going on at the law school. These people are adults. They've got ideas fixed from what happened before. The idea that law professors can brainwash students into thinking a certain way by the time they get to law school probably is not something we should be too worried about. The indoctrination comes at a much earlier age.
Yeah, thank you both. I'll hop back in just by starting and saying I don't think I would have made it through my freshman year at Georgetown without my Hoya stacks of bubbles. But aside from that, looking at undergraduate chapter of the Federalist Society here, many of us are considering applying to law school, and you talked earlier about the confirmation bias within admissions committees. How worried should we be, for example, about putting our Republican conservative bona fides, and how should we navigate publishing articles, for example? Is that a thing we should avoid, or is that a thing we should jump into and try to excel in?
My view on this is simple. That matters immensely for professors looking for jobs. It doesn't matter at all for students seeking admission to law school. I don't think you need to worry about ideological bias against you in applying to law schools. What you should worry about is your GPA and your LSAT score and the other things that go into the US News and World Report rankings, which is what the law schools actually care about.
I think it depends on the selection criteria law school uses. I agree that generally, again, based on my experience in Texas, at St. Thomas, at WashU in St. Louis, at other places, if you have the right LSAT and you have the right grade point and you have no criminal convictions, we're kind of done. And we don't even look at the rest of the file. But if you're on the bubble, if there are scholarship opportunities where we need to look at the file, then I think it can have some influence. And just as the concern about people applying to be law professors is real, there are certainly reports, but the reason they make the news is because people think they're odd and unusual, not because they think it's common. But there are reports of law firms where offers are extended in part on the comfortability of that person. And we're back to Jonathan Haidt's work that, and so I think it depends on what environment you're seeking a job in. I have students ask that all the time about, Professor, I'd really like to write about the contraceptive mandate, or I'd like to write about abortion, or I'd write to the, aid in dying. But I don't want to get published. And I always say to them, peel off a very technical part of it, like a statutory analysis of the language in the Uniform Act, and publish a article with that, and write the bigger part for me for your senior thesis. So.
On matters like this, you should get the best advice you can from people who actually know how the admissions process works. And there are consultants who do that. You should never listen to me or people like me, because my opinion is do what you enjoy, do what you care about, never hide. If you do good work because you're writing something that you believe in and really care about, and that's what makes you do good work, do it because it's your best work. The idea that you can conceal things, that usually doesn't work. And when you try to conceal things so that you don't care as much, then the product you produce isn't as good. The older we get, the more we understand what our parents meant when they looked at us and told us, the world's not fair, get used to it. And The world's not fair. Get used to it. Our job is to overcome the unfairness by being the best we can be, and just go for it. You'll have, if you are a discriminated against minority, either because you're African American or because of your religion or for any other reason, or because you're a Republican or because you're a conservative, that's the way things are. Your job is to overcome the unfairness by doing such good work that people recognize it. And so I don't think you should ever hide. If you're committed to a conservative position and you've got something you want to write that makes your point strongly, write it, publish it. The better publication it is, the harder it is to ignore.
I agree with that generally, but prudence is the
Yes.
charioteer of all virtue.
I said, don't listen to me, right?
Which I said, you write the big important piece to you, and then you peel off a technical piece, because frankly, the day-to-day lawyering, that's what you're going to be doing, is the technical statutory construction. And that's what you publish, but you have a better understanding and command of it because you've written the bigger piece.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we're that far off. But.
Yeah, but I think you should listen to Teresa for the following reason. My degree is a philosophy degree. I have a PhD in philosophy. Why would you ever take practical advice from someone like that?
Next.
Well, thank you for that one. This is my final question. So if you have any out there in the audience, put them in the Q&A tab and I'll read them off. But we've just been discussing a slate of mythical creatures here. And at some point in the future, it'd be nice if we did have more conservative law professors. What lessons can we learn, A, from the success of the Federalist Society, and B, what can and should we, as young conservatives mostly interested in this field, be doing to make that a future reality?
Clerkships are important afterwards. I mean, I can tell you how to become I can tell you the common path to being a law professor. And so, if that is your goal, you certainly need to go to the best law school you can get into, not necessarily the school that gives you the biggest scholarship. Although, as an economic conservative as well as a social conservative, I hate that you're going to graduate with debt. And I think you need to give some real thought about where you work. Not all federal judges or law professors come from the big firms, but I haven't looked at the statistics lately, but it used to be, and John, you may know them, something like 75% of all law schools or all law professors come from 20 law schools.
It's going to be less than that.
Yeah, and to that extent also, I am a mythical creature. I am the accidental law professor. I had no intentions of being a law professor. And then one of our faculty members at Oklahoma died, and they needed somebody, and our firm funded a chair, and the firm said, if you think she'd be a good teacher, we'll give her a year toward partnership and she can come be a substitute teacher for a year. And that's how I got into teaching. So it seems like to me, John's been much more intentional with his LLM and with his devotion to law teaching. I truly am an accidental law professor. Now it's ended up being my career for 30 years, but it wasn't anything I planned for. This is not the present I anticipated in the past.
Yeah, your question is an interesting question because you said, what can be done to change the ideological makeup of the professoriate so that it's more evenly distributed? And I don't think there's anything that can be done in the short run, but these kind of changes take place over a long time period. So for example, I'm appearing for the Federalist Society tonight, and I'm a member of the Federalist Society. The reason for that is I'm not a conservative. The reason for that is because when the Federalist Society was formed, it was formed to have debates between different viewpoints. And typically the Federalist Society we'll have somebody from the left and somebody from the right present two different viewpoints to an audience and make the arguments. And to me, that's a good way of engaging in ideas and learning. And that's balanced. So my institute at Georgetown has the same thing. We always have a wide range of ideological diversity in anything that we do. So over enough time, that can have a little bit of an effect. Jonathan Haidt has started the Heterodox Academy, which is designed to try to get the different viewpoints speaking to each other and being tolerant and listening to each other. And it's new, it's starting out, but it's starting to grow. What will things be like in 15 or 20 years? And the answer is they could be much worse or they could be much, much better. It depends on how things develop. It took a long time to get to the situation we're in now with oppressive atmospheres in which people are afraid to speak out, and a world in which parents don't want their kids to marry Democrats or Republicans. It took a long time to develop that kind of thinking. And things tend to switch. When I was a boy, McCarthyism was the problem. We went through the 60s, which was the free speech movement got the 60s going. And now we're back in the world of McCarthyism on the other side. I have reason to believe that we can go in the other direction. And at the Federalist Society and the Heterodox Academy, and professors who care about these things and are willing to work to stimulate dialogue are the sort of leading or the cutting edge right now that are starting to move things in other directions. And I have this unfounded belief that most students want to engage in open exchange, and it's a very small radical minority on each side that wants to be dogmatic and oppressive. And eventually we can, eventually we can reach the students who actually want to have open dialogue, and we'll get there. But I don't see a short-term solution.
And in fact, the Federalist Society is actively trying to promote an increase of conservative and libertarian law faculty. They have fellowships, they have, there's also the Alliance Defending Freedom that has what's called the Blackstone Fellowships during the summers. They have an undergraduate program as well. So there are national movements and national organizations that are trying to help young people navigate through this and get the most valuable and the best experience possible. If you're a Blackstone, one of our students came back after clerking for the Attorney General of Louisiana during the recent case that dealt with abortion, and was, had a wonderful experience. They clerk in all sorts of different places. So conservatives are not quiescent on this. I mean, and the Federalist Society is one of the, look at the influence they've had over judicial appointments for the past 4 years. Now, that influence will wane for the next at least 2, and if the Senate gets strengthened again, perhaps we'll be back. But I absolutely.
I don't know whether this will sound positive or negative to you, but the way in which you get more of the non-left-wing voices into the legal professoriate, there's a way to do it. It means that people who are conservative or people who are libertarian have to do better work. Right? The way you get in is you do the best work. There might be some bias against conservative thinking. There's no bias against an article published in the Harvard Law Review. If you do the better work, you can get in, and that's a blessing and a curse. The blessing is we know we have to do it. Like, I can never take a shortcut. If I get one footnote wrong, people will pick on it. There's no shortcuts. You have to do better work. Whereas if I'm in the mainstream, they don't check anything, right? You can get away with lots of shortcuts. The need to do better work to make a change is the right incentive structure for those of us that would like to go into the academy. So it makes things more difficult, but it also gives us the incentive to produce the right outcome.
And for the law students that are on this call, I want to emphasize, you are not just passive passengers on this. We are one of the few academic disciplines where law students hold the key to the journals.
Yeah.
They're student edited. That's just unheard of in other disciplines. And so if you're a conservative law student, your accomplishments matter. Fair student evaluations, because I'll guarantee you that to the extent people are trying to figure out how not to tenure someone, what students say matters, and you need to be responsible in that, both to liberal and conservative law professors. But don't blow it off and think, well, nobody actually reads these, because at least at the universities I've taught at, they read them and they discuss them, and it can have an influence. And they will certainly be used as a battering ram. It's John's point, missteps are embarrassing for some, but can be lethal for others. So
I should shut up and let you get to questions, but I want to underscore that because it's another aspect of legal education that's distinct. It's completely distinct from graduate school. In graduate school, if you're a graduate student, you're a peasant for like 6 years. You're just a slave laborer, and maybe you get a job afterwards. Not a law student. Law students, after the first year, run the journals. And in the second and third year, all of us professors who need a publication to make our careers, we have to go beg the students to publish us. The students make the judgments. And students, the journals could have liberals on it, could have conservatives on it, could have libertarians. You don't know the ideological makeup of the student journals. They're the ones who make the publication decision, and they want good articles because it's a competitive market. Every journal wants to get the best article. If you have a minority ideological viewpoint, you can get published in law journals much easier than in any peer-reviewed journals, which are controlled by professors. So the opportunity is greater. Plus, you're a student. In the second year, you have all the power. Right? That's what's good about being a law student.
You're willing to work hard, but that's what makes influence.
Yeah, but I'm going to shut up. You should just let the people who have questions get in.
Yeah, fantastic. The first two, and I'm gonna tie these together from Jack and Go Cool. They talk about fears in applying to law school about putting certain things on their resume. Is that a concern they should have, or is that really focused on the GPA alone? It doesn't matter where you worked so long as you worked somewhere.
My opinion is, if you want to present yourself as the most full and competent and accomplished person you can, and if you hide things and don't put them on your resume, it just looks like you've done less, right? If you're worried about ideological bias against you, that's a feature of the world. That's the way it is. I don't think you can escape it by hiding it. Present yourself honestly and fully in all your glory, and you'll go wherever you go. By the way, you'll get into law school. And the difference between going to Harvard and going to the University of Maryland really doesn't matter that much for your career as a lawyer. It might matter if you want to be a law professor, but there's only a few of us who are stupid enough to want to do that. So if you want to be a lawyer, you'll get it. All law schools serve students who have graduated from college and were successful enough to get admitted to law school. It's a wonderful group of people to study with. So I wouldn't hide things that go to Yale if it means that I'm going there instead of Duke.
And again, as little as, when you're a visiting professor, you don't know as much about the selection process as you do when you are a tenured faculty member. But having visited at a number of law schools and discussed it with colleagues at a number of law schools, there's almost no place where the right numbers don't get you in. So, I mean, the resume doesn't even get looked at until we're in the scholarship decision making, or unless you're on the bubble. And so I would not fail to put it in. But if the question is GPA or working for the National Republican Committee, depends on how big a jump in the GPA, but I'd say go after the GPA.
And most law schools want at least some
Activities.
Republicans around. No, but
Yes.
they want some people who represent the other point of view. So it doesn't necessarily work against you.
Yeah, so we've got 2 questions left, and I think we'll close out here about 9:10. First one is anonymous, and the question is, what do you see as the primary value of receiving a law degree? And I'm going to add a bit to that in the sense that many students at Georgetown, many people I see in the chat are politics, public service, government oriented. So if you could frame it in that lens as well, all the better.
Yeah, it's a good question.
I once had a student say that if she ever won the lottery, all of her children and grandchildren would be required to get a law degree that she would pay for. And I said, you want a family full of lawyers? What about a few doctors, a few journalists? And she said, no, professor, I don't want them to be lawyers necessarily, but it's the most amazing training in citizenship that you can get. You don't know how to deal with the health department because of COVID restrictions on your restaurant. You don't know how to deal with, grandpa's will and that it's a wonderful education. So a law degree will rarely provide zero benefits, even if you don't want to practice law. If you go through law school and you think, I really do. In fact, one of the students I had to dinner last night, what he really wants to do is open up a restaurant. But for a while, he wants to learn more about restauranteering by representing people in the food industry. It's a smart move.
I think it's a very important question. It's a good question. I often am in the position of advising undergraduates about law school. My answer is going to be a little different. I made it seem as though I was very positive about legal education. I was saying why it's great, why it's the best education, and that's true. But going to law school is 3 years of time and it's expensive. I believe you should not go to law school unless you know why you're going to law school. If you want to be a lawyer, you should go to law school. It's possible that you understand what you're going to use your law degree for, even if you don't want to practice. Have a good reason to go to law school. If you don't, then sometime around the middle of the first year, probably when you've been preparing for your classes for 2 months and they give you your first writing assignment, and now you're staying up till 3 a.m, you're going to say to yourself, why am I doing this? And if you don't have a good answer to that, the law school experience can be arduous and you may not finish. It's a great experience, but it's a lot of work and it takes time from your life. And those are the years where you can start your earning and get going. It's going to be hard to make those up. So have a good reason for going to law school. The best reason to go to law school is you want to be a lawyer. Some people will say, I want to go to law school because I want to be a law professor. That's like saying I want to be a movie star. You're like rolling the dice and it's a tournament type of thing. If you are willing to take that kind of risk, maybe you should go for it. But the best reason to go to law school is you think it would be a good life to practice law as your profession. And then you'll have a good time and you'll finish.
But that doesn't just mean being in a courtroom, right? You may be general counsel to a major hospital. You may be general counsel you may be legal counsel for the city. You may be the county attorney. So lawyers do a ton of interesting stuff. So
you'll find out in law school, like you'll find out, I love litigation. I really like this stuff. Or, man, do I hate that? I want to be in the books writing stuff. I mean, there's some people who love the performance and become litigators, but you learn that in law school. If you know you want to practice law, that's a reason to go.
Say, folks, I had one last question, but we just got a follow-up that I think would be worthwhile. So I'm gonna put 2 on, and this will be the final as I put them together. So first one, the follow-up from Stephen is, can you offer any advice on what you should emphasize on a resume? And then the other question from Louis is, what do you think is the relative importance of a free speech policy at law schools and at colleges? Does that have an impact, or is that mostly a piece of paper that gets covered in dust?
Those are two great questions, and we're supposed to cover those in like 3 minutes. Okay, give me the first one again, because that one I can answer quickly.
What should you emphasize on your resume if you're applying to law schools?
Okay, so I don't have a wide range of knowledge on this, but I do know what Georgetown does. And I don't think Georgetown is aberrant. So what the director of admissions at Georgetown says is, after you look at the numbers, he wants to put together a first-year class of interesting people. So if your application says what every application says, which was, ever since I was 10 years old, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I grew up watching Law and Order, and then you sound like everybody else. You're not that interesting. If your application says, when I was climbing Mount Everest last year, I had an entirely new perspective well, that's a pretty interesting person. So I emphasize what makes you distinctive, interesting, why you'd be someone that they'd like to have around. And I think the people at Georgetown who do this, they take it pretty seriously, because everybody who applies is good and smart. Why not go for people who have the other characteristics that would make an interesting class? So that was one question. Let me let Teresa in on that one.
I absolutely agree. So our examples are a little bit different, but I have a student right now who represented the Presbyterian Church at the UN, which is really fun in my international human rights class, because she has a very interesting perspective. And then I have a couple of students I have a student from Ethiopia that was with their State Department. So I have no idea what their numbers were, but with that sort of credential, I don't know that they certainly got in regardless. And I'll bet their numbers were pretty good, because they're both smart.
And then what was the other question, the last one?
How important is a free speech policy at universities?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's something I'm still working on at Georgetown. And so I was involved with Georgetown's committee that revised our speech and expression policy. And we've incorporated the Chicago statement into Georgetown's official policy. Is that enough? The answer is no. It's not enough. More is needed. And you can have that as part of your doctrine. It doesn't matter unless there are incentives that produce a good result. First of all, the problem these days, as Teresa pointed out, is not the administration trying to suppress speech. It's that there's a suppression that's cultural. It's the Jonathan Haidt walking on eggshells problem, where you're afraid to speak up in front of students. So that's one issue. But as far as policies go, if you get the Chicago principles into your basic policy, you now need something that makes it real. So I'm trying to convince Georgetown that there should be another aspect of the policy, which says that no one will be charged or have to answer for the violation of any university policy if the only evidence against the person is the content of what he or she has said. And you may not have been at Georgetown long enough, but a few years ago, there was something called a Love Saxa group that was attacked as a hate group because they supported monogamous marriage between a man and a woman. And the objection to the group was only about their beliefs and what they articulated. What you want is a freedom of expression policy that means you can't say someone's violating a university policy simply on the basis of the content of what they're saying. It has to be action. And so that's where you need to go next. And I hope that Georgetown goes there, but we're still in the midst of trying to get the speech and expression policy to be the way it should be.
Well, and Georgetown has the same challenges, although perhaps even larger challenges than the University of St. Thomas. when I describe the university, I say that we hold ourselves out to be Catholic. Now, the fact that Pope Benedict appointed me to a Pontifical Council tells you pretty much where I stand on church teaching. But you have an interesting problem with the fact that if you have a religiously affiliated or private, many other types of private universities, there are prior commitments that are very different than when you're at the public universities, where they are structured and created for a different purpose. And so I think a free speech policy is important. John makes the point, though, which is absolutely true. You can have the letter of the law that's enforced, or you can just have the law in the books. And that's part of the concern, right? And that's his point about it has to be actionable. It has to be. By the same token, though, a place like Georgetown, a place like St. Thomas, Pepperdine, BYU, there is a worldview that is the foundation of the institution itself, and that's a much more complex conversation.
Professor Collett, Professor Hassness, thank you so much. I've so thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and we want to now turn it over to Nicholas for the closing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you both as well. This was a very, very informative event. I knew we were going to be talking a lot, obviously, about the ideological diversity, but I think a lot of us here were very appreciative of sort of the advice you gave about law school in general. I know I am. I'm sure Brady is as well. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Brady, for joining us and moderating tonight. And thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Very well done, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you.